A few days ago, I posted this photo on the post-processing subreddit, and since it got around 1000 upvotes, I think it's worth it to make a quick video talking through my workflow and things that I focused on while doing my edit. And I'm gonna start by talking about exposure, because I purposely shot this overexposed, and you can see that my t-shirt is almost gleaming. That was my benchmark. I was looking at the histogram on my phone, which was in here, and I made sure that I was not clipping anything, but other than that I wanted as much exposure as possible to retain some details in these shadows over here that I can later work on while editing the photo. Because let's be honest, while the light is super nice, the composition is not exactly perfect, and I want to be able to reshape some of the light to improve my composition down the line. Now let's go back to my edit, pull down the exposure just a bit, and as you can see, the shirt is super bright. That's not something that I want in my final edit because it's gonna be distracting. And we can see that even better if I turn on false color, where the shirt got orange and red tones into it, meaning that it's almost clipping and the face is just bright yellow and gray tones, and that means slightly over midpoint. So I probably used a radial gradient, and in this radial gradient I'm gonna be pulling down my highlights and my whites to remove the distraction of the shirt. I said highlights, not shadows, sorry. Something like this. You see that the shirt is not standing out in the false color view, and we can see this even better when it turns off false color and the shirt is just there, part of the image, but not the center of attention, and that's because it's no longer the brightest thing in the photo. Now, going back in false color, we can also see that most of my photo resides in the blue and deep blue tones. That means underexposed and severely underexposed. And that's really not a great composition because all this area over here is basically dark tones with a spot that's bright right here. And instead of that, let's take a look at how my final edit looks in false color and what the differences are. And we can see that after a ton of masking, I end up with what's basically a diagonal line where what's above the line gets a lot brighter and what's below the line gets a lot darker, where I'm hiding the details over here because they don't really matter, but also this look is grounding the photo, making it look more realistic, because when you go outside, the sky on top is gonna be bright and the things on the ground are gonna look a bit darker. And that's exactly what I'm trying to emulate here with lots and lots of masking. And in most of those masks, I only adjusted things like exposure, shadows or highlights to shape the light and get a better composition. But because you're not going to be editing my photo, I'm not going to go through them one by one, and I'm going to skip to the next super important thing that made this photo look good in the end. And that's white balance, because I shot this photo right before sunset. You can see that the sunlight is pretty orange, and also because the sun was filtered by the leaves of the trees around me, I got a ton of bounced light that was pretty heavily green tinted. So when I tried to fix the white balance by pulling on the blue orange slider, you can see that my shadows are going towards magenta. And while I could try and fix that by playing with the tint, my photo now starts to look super green, and that's not really the vibe that I'm going after. So instead of pushing the tint super hard, I'm actually going to scroll down to the calibration tab and push a bit of green in the shadows, and that would get rid of the magenta shadows, but also not force me to push my entire image into a very green tone. And we can see this even better if we push the saturation and the vibrance slider to 100%. Now my shadows on the rocks are tinted a bit blue. My highlights are still pretty warm, and that's gonna look awesome in the final edit, but there's no more magenta in all of my shadows, and I also didn't push green so far that my shadows are starting to get green. I'm trying to keep them as neutral as possible, so probably in this case something around plus 19 is good enough. I'm mostly looking at this part over here in the bottom right part, where I have a pretty solid shadow, but also keeping an eye on these rocks over here, which should look slightly blue, but not heavily tinted, either towards blue or towards magenta. Now let's reset my vibrance and saturation, and this is how flat the photo should look like before I start color grading. And when I said flat there, I didn't mean flat as in lacking contrast, because my photo does have a lot of contrast now that I fixed the exposure. I meant flat in terms of color, where it only has some color contrast between highlights and shadows. My highlights are warmer, my shadows are a bit on the cooler side, but overall the photo looks super neutral, and this makes it much easier for me to inject my colors in the next step, which is color grading. And for color grading, I'm always using color response curves. I know this is gonna sound like a huge ad, but these are a set of RGB curves that I created and that I also sell as presets on my website. But the idea is that when you apply them, the tone curve or for luminance remains intact, and you're getting the colors from specific films, so you can easily emulate the film look without messing up all your settings. If you want to learn more, there's a video that I'll put on screen right now. That's also super cringe to watch because it was one of my first video, but the information remains valid. But let's go back to this photo, and for this one I think I used Kodak Gold 200 in my original edit, but as you can see, most of them look nice and work this well just because I actually took the time to get a good exposure throughout my photo, so the color curve actually have something to latch onto and imprint the film color that we're trying to emulate in our edits. And when I apply this kind of stuff, I usually only do a few more things afterwards. I play around with the HSL if I want to target a specific problem, like the sky in this photo, but we're gonna come back to that. And maybe add a bit of more color grading using the color wheels. And afterwards, I always apply a mask that's gonna cover the entire photo, a linear gradient, something like this. I just clicked outside the photo and dragged up to regain my black point and my white point. And I can actually imprint a fade that's not specific to my film stock or the curves or the tone curve that I used in my previous steps. So now that I have pure black and pure white in the photo, I can come in here with one more of this mask, and let's do that again. I'm clicking outside, dragging up, and I can imprint a specific fade throughout all my photos. And it's something that I started doing recently because I noticed that most of my photos that emulated film had some fade to them, but the black level was all over the place and I was lacking consistency in my portfolio. And I find it a bit ironic that I only started doing that now because a few years ago I actually released a product called a filmic tone limiter, which applies a fade on any photo. So if I had the discipline to do this years ago, I would actually have a very consistent portfolio with faded black and white points. But I started doing it now, and that's better than ever. But going back to my photo, I tweaked the white balance some more to fit the Kodak Gold look, so I added a few hundred more points in the white balance, and I also used HSL to desaturate the skies some more because I don't wanted blue to be a distraction from all the green and yellow tones in the final photo. And also, usually after applying my color response curves, I come in here and tweak the tone curve so I can get some more contrast or just fine-tune the look. In this case, I just brought down the shadows a tiny bit, and finally I added a bit of orange in my midtones and a bit of cyan in my highlights. Usually I would add orange or red tones in my shadows, but with this photo being so dark, if I actually go ahead and put any type of warmth into my shadows, it's gonna be overpowering. So I left the shadows wheel untouched and I used the midtones for my split toning in this case. And finally, let's very briefly touch on texture, because I shot this photo with a very heavy diffusion filter that was both white and black. DIY black mist filter if you wish, but it acted like a low contrast filter and a black mist diffusion at the same time, so the photo looked super glowy. But in the final photo, you don't really see that because on top of all that diffusion, I actually added a pretty heavy layer of grain. And of course, I did that using one of my presets that applies various amounts of grain according to the luminance values in the photo. But the only thing is that Lightroom actually only takes into consideration the luminance value that were present at the moment of capture. So if you take a look at the mask, over here for my shadows, Lightroom, it's considering that only these are shadows, so I had to tweak my preset a bit for my original edit, so the shadows were a bit broader. I limited my midtones because right now the photo was all mid-tone according to Lightroom, and also tweak the highlights. So tweaking the luminance range of the grain mask was important for this photo because of the way it was captured. I shot with the idea in mind that I wanted to acquire as much data as possible, and that put most of my original unedited photo into midtones. And because the luminance range mask in Lightroom is taking into consideration the original photo, I had to do a bit of tweaking to my grain mask and grain presets specifically for this photo. And keep in mind that my all-in-one grain preset also reduces sharpness and added a bit of negative clarity to shadows and midtones to emulate how actual film works. So that's why my final edit has this dreamy look but still retains some texture because of the grain. And that's about it for today's video. If you feel like you learned something, make sure to hit the like and the subscribe button, and if you want to support me and the type of work that I do, check out my Lightroom preset store that's available on my website. And if you watch the entire video, use the code reditpp from postprocessing, because that's the subreddit that started this entire video, and you're gonna get 15% off for the next month starting from the day that I release this video. Once again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.